Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a million for coming along to this Whittaker webinar, where we're going to take a look or aim to examine whether so-called curtailable contracts may have potential or may help avoid what we call electricity blackouts. It's quite a topic. Electricity blackouts, as we know, this winter has been very topical and continues to be topical. We'll address both of these things throughout the course of this webinar. So the research is based on work by myself and other colleagues, Valentin Birch at Ruhr University Bochum in Germany and Harrison Fell at Columbia University in New York. Okay, so to demonstrate and just with a bit of motivation for why this is important or why this could be interesting, I suppose we all know to help combat climate change at the moment, many countries are decarbonising their electricity systems by moving away as such from the traditional fossil fuels of oil and coal and of course peat in the case of Ireland towards renewable energy sources such as wind, hydro and solar. And basically, as it stands, our electricity demand is 40% of our electricity, over 40% of our electricity demand is met from these renewable energy sources. And the aim in Ireland is for the demand to be met by 70% of demand to be met by renewable energy sources by 2030. So there's a massive expansion or planned expansion of renewable energy sources. Combined with this expansion, then there's also a growth in electricity demand. Okay, it's brought about by a number of factors: increasing incomes of late, a change in consumer tastes towards the electrification of heat and transport. So many more homes are installing heat pumps and getting their primary heat source from electricity. And many homes, of course, are purchasing electric vehicles. So this all has implications for higher demand for electricity. And then, of course, we have an increase in demand from data centers, and again, in the Irish case as well. So we have this large rising demand for electricity combined with this expansion of renewable energy onto our grid. And that has overall significant implications for the future of the electricity system, with the primary concern being how the system can maintain balance between the supply of electricity and the demand for electricity. So why is that important? Well, the electricity system itself is a finely tuned, synchronized system, okay, where the overall aim is to maintain what we call the frequency of electricity at 50 hertz, okay, all of the time. And it's our transmission services operator, which in Ireland is EirGrid, are responsible for the management of that system, and they must maintain the grid at 50 hertz at all times. So therefore, if there's a sudden increase in demand, that would correspond to a decrease in the frequency of electricity. And of course, then EirGrid will be tasked with trying to meet that increase in demand by additional generation. Okay, so they would ramp up electricity generation to maintain the balance again and keep it stable at 50 hertz. And on the other end of things, if of course there's an increase in supply over and above demand, then that equates to a rise in the frequency of electricity on the system, and of course then with responsibility to reduce down that supply, okay, by curtailing either power generation of some sort. So what happens then, though, is, this all has to happen, this balance has to happen within seconds. And EirGrid are tasked with this balancing act within seconds. And if it doesn't happen, where, for example, there is a sudden increase in demand, and that sudden increase in demand is not met or matched with an increase in supply from power generation, then what happens is a severe consequence of that is imbalance is what we call a blackout, okay, whereby the grid operator can't correct the situation, the imbalance within the seconds that it should, and therefore the grid becomes unstable and will fail. Okay, and you may have then regional blackouts or correspondingly you could have a nationwide blackout as a result. So I suppose one of the most high-profile recent blackouts was, of course, this time last year in Texas. So we all remember the news, where basically in Texas it went through unprecedented low temperatures. which meant that there was a massive rise in demand for electric heat from consumers, but that coincided then, of course, with the freezing of different components on the network that didn't allow the flow of gas to go to the main power plants, and as a result, supply was reduced as well. So that balance between supply and demand was jeopardized, and as such, the grid failed, or there was ultimately what it was a controlled blackout in a sense, but there were other factors involved as well. But overall, then we had consumers in Texas that didn't have electricity for more than 3 days. Okay, which has serious implications. Monetary rise, billions lost to an economy, but also then hundreds of deaths and indirectly and directly caused as a result. So it's a pretty serious event, and it's an event that typically the TSO, or the transmission service operator, is going to aim to avoid to all intents and purposes. So this system balance currently in Ireland and in most of the world relies upon the traditional sources of flexibility on the supply side. Okay, so we're basically, if there is a mismatch, they either ramp up the power, ramp up electricity generation. Okay, call upon your gas powered station or your coal powered station to produce more electricity, or in the event where the frequency is too high on the grid, then they'll get them to reduce down electricity generation. Okay. Now, with the advent, of course, of renewables and the increasing penetration of renewables onto the system, they don't have that same flexibility. Okay, they don't have that flexibility at all. It's very difficult when there's an increase in demand and the wind isn't blowing to tell the wind turbines or tell the wind to blow. Essentially, it's not. So what we're relying on is still the traditional sources. We're still relying on our coal and gas plants to make up that gap, to make up that margin. So because we can call upon those and get them to ramp up. And of course, as more and more renewables come on board the system, the more and more volatility is introduced in that scenarios. Okay, so we need a lot more reserve capacity. And of course, if you're watching the news last week, you will have seen that the plan has been for 9 new gas power plants to come on board by 2024. EirGrid went to auction last Friday. So that is in order to increase that margin, such that gap, so that we can call upon the reserve capacity to plug the gap. Okay, but again, with the aim to have 70% of our electricity demand met by renewable energy sources, this will be a problem we could face in the future. And again, with rising demands, again, it's ever more complex. Okay, as you'll see, I mean, of course, with the report from EirGrid back in October, that with the kind of unprecedented number of what they call amber alerts, or properly called system alerts, where it basically, they've gone in with this margin between electricity generation and demand has become quite slim at times. Okay, so it is cause for concern. So there's a requirement or a need for other sources of flexibility, and in particular, demand side flexibility is a potential option. Okay, and it is used. Okay, demand response is an instrument, a flexibility instrument, to promote change in the energy use of consumers, and can be an effective way to balance these systems when you have large intermittent electricity generation. So intermittent, to mean, is like the wind isn't blowing all the time. Okay, so you won't have access to power from or electricity from turbines at all times. It's only when the wind is blowing. Okay, to simplify it. So you can have demand response broadly falls into 2 categories: information provision, or what we call financial incentive. Okay, and the information provision category is just very much you're feeding information to the homes, in different campaigns, ad campaigns, or information in their electricity bills that drop your thermostat by 1 degree, that power of one campaign, or or other information is, do you really need to have your thermostat at its highest point in an unoccupied room, and other sorts of information like that, where you get provision about energy efficiency opportunities. And then the other broad category falls into financial incentive to reduce your overall energy use. And the most common financial incentive is of course dynamic pricing, so-called dynamic pricing within electricity, where basically you change the prices of electricity are changed dependent on a peak period versus an on-peak period, as such, for load or for demand. So the most common one that's existed for a long time, of course, is the night saver. Okay, the night saver option, where it's cheaper to consume electricity in the nighttime, of course, when we have plenty of reserve capacity on the system, compared to others during the day, and particularly in the peak evening period. So the financial incentive in that regard is, well, prices are more expensive during that peak period, so shift your electricity consumption away from that peak period and into substitute it away to other times of the day when it's actually cheaper. Okay, so that's one of the most common ones in dynamic. And of course, then with the evolution of smart metering and smart loads as components of the overall smart grid, residential demand response has become much more effective, because now the information isn't only provided via the bill or via an ad campaign. The information can be real time via your smart meter. You get information upfront, such as in the response, maybe if there was a particular system alert that you could be said, well, there is a system alert, consider switching off some of your appliances, okay? Or, you know, you can look at the smart meter and see what the current price you are paying per kilowatt hour of electricity, okay? And that in the financial incentive side. So the smart grid as much as has enabled this. And then, of course, with the evolution of the smart grid, it can support other types of financial or incentive-based instruments, demand side instruments as well. And one such demand side instrument is what we're going to look at today, is the curtailable or interruptible electricity contract. Okay, and typically we're going to look at it from a curtailable point of view as opposed to an interruptible, and I'll explain that in a moment. So this basically is a contract where a utility, you know, such as your ESB or your board gas, enters into an agreement, of course, getting your agreement in a contract to compensate you to get access to your load. Okay, in this case, is to get access typically to your demand for electricity or your energy use, to either interrupt it entirely. Okay, so that's just to switch it off entirely. Okay, or to curtail it to some degree during periods of system instability, okay, or to reduce it back so that you maybe can't use all the appliances at home, but you can at least power the lights and the whatever else, okay. So this is a particular demand response financial incentive, in the sense that the consumer is being paid for their flexibility, as such they're being flexible around their energy use. And what we're going to look specifically today at is the end use specific contracts, and these are curtailable contracts in that the load curtailed, or the load that's removed as such, is directly related to the final energy service provided. Okay, so you know, we don't, in economics we typically would call this a derived demand. Electricity is a derived demand. We don't consume electricity directly for its own use. We consume electricity because of the final energy service it provides, because it runs our washing machine, okay, it runs our electric oven, it runs our lights, or powers our lights, and so on and so forth. Okay, so basically the end use specific part of it is basically the curtailment is at the level of the appliance. Okay, so for example, a remotely operated power button on a washing machine. So if you enter into this contract, the utility then has the option at times of system instability to knock off the power to your washing machine. Okay. And of course, we're interested in this mainly around peak load, okay, peak period for demand, okay, and that peak period for demand is typically, and we see here in the graph, this is a load curve for residential load curve for Ireland in 2008. This is the overall system level load curve, and then this is the overall system level load curve in blue there for 2017. Okay, but just looking at the grey load curve here, you can see here we have this peak between 5 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the evening. Okay, and the idea is that, you know, system imbalance is more likely to occur when you have this higher level of demand. Okay, when demand is at its peak in the system. Okay, when people are coming home from their work or education and so on and so forth, and turning on all their appliances and so forth. So basically, the aim of these curtailable contracts then would be to try and smooth this peak, so that you basically are like typically drawing maybe a line, I suppose, from here to 8, okay, as opposed to having this peak. So you're reducing down that peak, and reducing then the chance of there being a system imbalance, because the demand side is looked after as opposed to in the supply side. So with that in mind, and in that context, what we need to understand, well, is there an acceptance of these types of contracts, or is there a preference for these type of contracts, these end use specific curtailable contracts in electricity? Because of course, I mean, if nobody wants to give up consumption of energy for certain appliances at that time of the evening, then there's no point in pursuing those type of contracts. So overall, first of all, the primary aim of the research I present here today is basically examine those consumer preferences for end-use specific curtailable contracts on different household appliances in Ireland during the peak load hours of between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. in the evening. And then as a follow-up to that, based on the research objectives in research question 1 here, essentially, is we're going to pull some of the outputs that we get from that around the preferences of consumers, such as their choice probabilities, so the likelihood that they're going to choose or opt into these particular types of contracts, together combined with their expected compensations as such for this type of contract. We're going to then aim to, in a kind of a back of the envelope calculation, going to aim to estimate the potential curtailable load. So what is the potential load that we can curtail here based on the information we have from consumer preferences? And then we're going to look then at the net benefits to the system under a selection of current contract offerings. So then, given that that's a potential curtailable load, we can estimate potential savings. And then we can also estimate the potential compensations that's required. And of course, the potential savings minus the compensations then will give us the net benefits to the system. Okay, so we'll look at that as well. So the overall research method to elicit these preferences from consumers is something called a discrete choice experiment, where basically each respondent to the experiment is faced with a selection of hypothetical electricity contracts. Okay, and in these contracts, you have very varying characteristics, okay? And one of those characteristics, of course, is going to be curtailment on individual household appliances. And the appliances we're going to look at are the washing machine, the tumble dryer, the dishwasher, and the electric oven, which of course are the largest energy consuming white goods that the household would typically use. So then basically what happens across different choice sets, individuals are asked to select their preferred alternative by making trade-offs between all of the different characteristics that make up each contract. Okay, and it's in that task that we're able to isolate, I suppose, what attributes have the most influence on their preference or most influence on their choice. Okay. A monetary compensation is also included in the form of what we call an electricity bill discount. Of course, they're offered a discount in each contract. Each contract that contains curtailment of some sort. And this is then allows us to indirectly infer or calculate or estimate the willingness to accept based on how respondents trade off the other attributes, the other characteristics, which I'll come to in a moment, against the different compensations they're offered. Okay, so they're offered different discounts across these contracts to engage in these contracts. And we can see then how they trade off those discounts against the other attributes, and then we can indirectly infer what their willingness to accept for such a contract is, okay, in monetary terms. So one important thing that we have to look into when it comes to designing these contracts are the attributes or the so-called characteristics that make up the contracts, okay? So we had to spend a lot of time with focus groups and pilots in order to kind of narrow these down, what's determined to be most important from a system perspective, as well as, of course, from the consumer, importantly from the consumer perspective, okay? And of course, we don't want to bombard these with hundreds, because of course we could have loads of different attributes that we would be interested in these type of contracts. But of course, by doing that, we have to take into account the cognitive ability of consumers to be able to trade off these different attributes and levels of attributes in each contract. So we've stuck with 5 attributes, okay, which is typically what the literature would suggest between 4 and 5. Okay. So the first attribute, of course, is the appliance to be curtailed. So remember, this is a curtailment at the level of the appliance. So the appliance to be curtailed can be either the electric oven, the tumble dryer, the dishwasher, or the washing machine. Okay, so that's the type of household appliance that's specifically going to be curtailed in this contract that you enter into with your particular utility. The other then attribute, of course, is the max frequency of curtailment. So the maximum number of times per month the curtailment event could take place. And we've gone with 3 per month, 6 per month, or 9 times per month, okay? So of course, the frequency you imagine is an important thing. And if the frequency is going to be very small, you think you'd have more preference for it, versus if it's going to be a lot of what we call curtailment events, where there's a situation where there is system instability, where we may need to call upon these contracts to fill the gap. The other then level or attribute that we look at is advance notice, and it's given 2 levels, yes and no. So some of the contracts will contain an advance notice, so whether or not you receive an advance notice of at least 12 hours, and some contracts won't contain it. Some contracts then will contain an opt-out, whether or not you have an opt-out from 1 curtailment event per month, or some contracts won't have that opt-out. Now, the opt-out became, from the focus groups, it was clear that lots of consumers were concerned about, if you don't have the advance notice and all of a sudden you're planning, whether it be you've got to have a shirt washed for the interview the next day, and all of a sudden there's a curtailment event, they wanted to have that opt-out in the case of an emergency, okay, in a sense. And then, of course, then we have the monetary compensation in the form of a bill discount, an electricity bill discount. And this is the compensation for curtailment as such. And we have the levels of €10, €20 and €30. So basically, what happens is that we go off and we get respondents to answer this survey. The survey is conducted online, and it's conducted online and drawn from a stratified sample as such, random sample from a panel of Research Now's, which is a highly prestigious international panel. And basically they have about access to 80,000 individuals in Ireland. And our key aim was that we get a representative sample of those individuals to take the experiment as such, to answer the choice experiment, but also to give us information, of course, about their different socioeconomic characteristics of their household and the individual of these bill pairs. So the first thing each of those respondents would have faced, though, was a video, a short animated video, which basically outlined what a curtailment was. So you see there in panel A, it's just a screenshot from that video. And again, it was just a voiceover explaining exactly what curtailment was. In the event of in a curtailment event, you wouldn't have access to your tumble dryer in the sense in that screenshot, where if the tumble dryer was running during an event, it would be paused for the duration or stopped for the duration of the event. And the details like that, okay? And then together with explaining what curtailment was, because again, of course, as a consumer, we're not typically, we typically don't know what a curtailable contract is. Then each of the actual attributes of the particular contracts then are explained, such as you can see here in panel B is the appliance to be curtailed, and they're told it's the washing machine, dishwasher, tumble dryer, electric oven. In the case where they have a washing machine dryer combo, they're to treat them both as separate appliances for the purpose of the experiment. And of course, then just 2 examples here of the advance notice, yes or no. And again, this is all explained to them in the short, and it's an animated video, as such an engaging short video that helps them to prepare, I suppose, for the experiment. Then each individual then, after that, I have to obviously fill in some information about themselves and their households, okay, in the form of some socioeconomic characteristics and details of the household, which we'll come to in a moment. And then they're faced with the selection, 8 choice sets, actually, 8 choice sets. And each choice set is like you see here on the screen, one example of it. This is choice card 1. They'll face 8 of these in total, okay? And each choice card, basically, the important thing is there's another attribute there in a sense, but that attribute is held constant, where the time of curtailment is fixed across all contracts between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. in the evening, just to keep engaging the respondent that this is a peak period, okay, that we're interested in. So here an example, then they're face off to 3 contract A, contract B, and contract C. And ultimately contract C in this case is the current contract as it is today. That's your status quo. That's just your contract, your business as usual contract with no curtailment, just as it is, okay? So they can opt to choose that if they don't like any of the other contracts. And here in contract A, we can see that curtailment will be on the tumble dryer. It'll be up to 9 times per month. You will have advance notice. There's no opt-out available, and the discount on your bi-monthly bill is €20, okay? And then you compare that, you trade off the different attributes between contract A and contract B, where you're actually curtailing the dishwasher. It's only 3 times per month. You have no advance notice, but yes, you do have an opt-out, and again, you're receiving the same discount in this particular scenario, okay? So basically, each respondent faces a series of 8 of these, and they choose the preferred option. And again, if they don't prefer either contract A or contract B, they can opt for contract C, okay, their status quo. And it's really important here that we have the baseline contract in there in order to be able to accurately estimate the change in contract, or the value in the change in contract. Okay. So as I say, we go off then to the panel research now, and we end up with a final sample of 972 bill payers from that panel. Okay, and again, the key thing for us was we were seeking a stratified random sample that was basically followed a sample frame from the 2016 census. So we wanted to match the 2016 census and be representative as best it could, and in particular in terms of gender, age, in the geographic region based on a NUTS 3 region here, as well as in primary economic status, which we see in the other one. Okay, but given that we were matching on those, the likelihood is that we're matching representativeness then across a spectrum of different variables, and we can see that this is a highly representative sample of bill payers. Over 18 in Ireland. Okay, you can see here gender is matching, male, female. You've got in the first column is what our total sample proportion is, and in the second column is the national statistics based on either the census 2016 or the household budget survey from 2015-2016 as well. Okay, so and again, it's important to mention that this survey was run in the summer of 2018. Okay, so, and again, see, we've quite a lot of representative across age, it's representative across region, representative across primary economic status, representative across urban rural. We can see here 63 versus 60, 36 versus 39, representative across tenure, number of households. So it's really nice in terms of representativity. And even in addition to that, we are representative by market share. Okay, so we asked each bill payer, each respondent, for their current electricity provider. Okay, and you can see there that's here on the left hand side, and then the right hand side is as per the national statistics, which is based on the regulator. We got information from the regulator on what the market share for each of the electricity suppliers at that stage was. And you can see there we have nice representative sample even in terms of the actual market share. Like 47% here are with Electric Ireland in our sample, whereas 50% are in the national statistics. Okay. And then, of course, we wanted it then to be representative, of course, in terms of ownership of appliances as well. So here we have our total sample, and here we have the national statistics. We don't have national statistics for ownership of the electric oven, but here you can see in terms of the ownership of the dishwasher, the washing machine, and the tumble dryer, we have it's representative as per what indicated in household ownership of appliances in the household budget survey. Okay, and that's good news. But the one interesting thing, I suppose, from this is that we are aware that there will be preference differences across, will be dependent upon ownership of these appliances as well. So ideally, for the purposes of a discrete choice experiment, you want individuals to be able to trade off amongst all the attributes, including the appliance. So you want them to be able to own the appliance, or want them to own the appliance in order to make accurate trade-offs. So we typically have to control for the fact that some of the individuals might not own all of the appliances in this. So we do that in our analysis as well, in order to have an accurate reflection of the actual preferences for this. So, for example, I mean, you would expect maybe if you didn't own the tumble dryer, that you'd hope that they would opt out of the tumble dryer and choose either the alternative contract presented to them or the status quo contract, okay, because they don't own it. It's typically what we call ignoring irrelevant alternatives. Okay, so basically we put our focus then on the sample that's owning all. There's 427 in total own all appliances, and here we can see the breakdown for the subsample not owning all appliances. Okay, and you can see there it's matched okay with in terms of the oven and the washing machine, but not so much. Not every household owns a tumble dryer or dishwasher. Okay, so that has implications for later on. So the model overall, and I'm not going to get bogged down into this, but just overall, just to give you a flavor of what's happening here, the analysis of the responses to the choice experiment are basically based on what we call random utility theory. Okay, it's this theory within economics. And basically, individuals choose the electricity contract that they deem provides the most utility, or it's the most preferred contract in essence. Okay, and basically what we can do then, based on their choices or their preferences, indicated by this indirect utility, this U, we're going to look at this being a function of all the attributes, where some attributes have more influence on your choice of contract, whether it be the appliance that's going to be curtailed versus other attributes, okay? And we're going to ultimately use what we call a random parameters logit model with correlated coefficients, which basically is going to estimate those parameters, those parameters which indicate the influence that each of these attributes have on your choice of a curtailable contract. So here are the results essentially, and what we're going to concentrate the results. We've got the different attributes here in the first column, and we have the mean coefficients here in the second column, okay? And what we're going to concentrate on is really is basically the sign of those coefficients, okay? And we'll talk about the other three columns in a moment. So of course we have the different attributes like the electricity discount, the electric oven, and then we've got this combined where we have to control for the fact that we essentially care about realistic trade-offs amongst owning all of the appliances. So we have this what we call an interaction term between electric oven and ownership. Okay, so this is the impact over and above the initial impact that comes about from owning all four appliances, or being able to make trade-offs between all four of those appliances. Okay, so for example, the coefficient on electricity discount is of course positive, and you'd expect to see that. So as the discount increases across the contracts, then you're more likely to choose contracts with higher discounts. Okay, as you'd expect. In terms of the electric oven, and again, that's highly statistically significant. And in terms of electric oven, you're less likely to choose contracts. You're much less likely to choose people given this negative coefficient and this large magnitude. We'll talk about that in a moment. You're much less likely to choose contracts that curtail the electric oven at the peak period in the evening. Okay, and again, there's no change between ownership of all four appliances versus those that own all four appliances and those that don't. Okay, it's basically the same coefficient because this is not statistically significant. Okay. Then in terms of the tumble dryer, if you don't own the tumble dryer, for example, if you don't own all appliances, then you're less likely to choose contracts that curtail the tumble dryer, okay, given this negative coefficient. So you're less likely to choose a contract that curtails the tumble dryer, but you're also less likely to own a tumble dryer. So that's good news in a sense. We want to see that on average, individuals were ignoring irrelevant alternatives. So if they didn't own the tumble dryer, they actually ignored that alternative in favor of one of the other alternatives or the status quo, okay, staying with their current contract. And then of course, then if you own all four appliances and then you're more favorable, okay, this is the positive, you're more likely to choose a contract that curtails the tumble dryer versus, I should say this is versus actually the washing machine. Our reference category here is the washing machine, just importantly, okay? So in comparison to the washing machine, if you own all four appliances, you're much more likely to want to choose a contract that curtails the tumble dryer, okay? That will curtail a tumble dryer versus the washing machine, okay? The same when it comes into the dishwasher. If you own all four appliances, you're much more likely to, compared to the washing machine, you're much more likely to opt to choose those contracts that curtail the dishwasher, okay? And, again, given you don't own, you again see this negative coefficient, okay, this negative response. So again, you're less likely to choose contracts that curtail the dishwasher compared to the washing machine. If you don't own all four appliances, but you're also less likely to own the dishwasher, so you'd expect to see this response. You'd hope that they ignore the dishwasher, and on average, they do that, okay? And then, of course, then we have the other attributes where we have frequency, and frequency in here we can see is a negative. So as the frequency of curtailment events increases, then, you're less likely to opt to choose those types of contracts, okay? As you'd expect, people don't want to be subjected to loads and loads of these curtailment events. And then we have a positive then coefficient on both advance notice and opt-out, okay, suggesting that these are favorable, okay? So if you have an advance notice, you're more likely to choose the contract. And if you have an opt-out, you're more likely to choose that contract as well. Okay, and then the final two attributes here that we have in our characteristics in this sense are what we call the alternative specific constant, or the status quo. So this is the status quo contract. And basically in the status quo contract, it is a positive coefficient. And so it says that you're more likely to choose the status quo contract when compared to the washing machine. Okay, so that would suggest it's a positive, but again, it's not statistically significant. Okay, so it's not different from zero. So what it indicates statistically is that you're indifferent between curtailing your washing machine and your current contract, the status quo, where you don't curtail anything. Okay, and this is the same with when we interact with the ownership or control for ownership in that sense. Okay, so one key and interesting calculation that we can look at from this is actually what we call the willingness to accept, where given that we can look at people's trade-offs versus the discount and the other attributes, we're able to estimate the willingness to accept, okay, or the minimum compensation that they would require to have that attribute in their contract. So here we see for the electric oven that the willingness to accept is €19.28. So basically, on average, consumers would have to get €19.28 discount from their bill if they were to curtail the electric oven on the bill. Okay, and then for the tumble dryer, we can see that when you don't own all four appliances, you'd expect to get, or you'd be willing to accept €5.44. Okay. But when you do own all four appliances, okay, it's going to be the combination of both this willingness to accept and this willingness to accept, which is technically a willingness to pay because it's a negative willingness to accept. Okay, so it's a willingness to pay. So basically, when you add 544 to this negative 1402, you get a willingness to accept for the ownership in this column of 858. Okay, so individuals are willing to pay to have their tumble dryer curtailed. Okay, so and again, this came out in focus groups as the sense that, you know, I always people in general have this aversion to the tumble dryer, in a sense where they correspond it with high energy use and they try to limit it as much, and the preference is to substitute for the washing line outside if at all possible. Okay, so we have this willingness to pay as such to curtail the tumble dryer. So basically, there's no compensation expected on average to curtail the tumble dryer. And the same when it comes to the dishwasher, of course, but the compensation or the willingness to accept measure is a little bit lower, okay, at minus 352. Okay, and then for each event, each curtailment event, individuals will be willing to accept €1.13 for each event. Okay, so they'd have to get a discount of €1.13 per event in order to accept the contract. Or if they've advance notice or opt out, they're willing to pay for that option. They're willing to sacrifice discount as such to have the option. They value advance notice of at least 12 hours, and they value having an opt out from one curtailment event per month. Okay, so they're willing to pay as such for that. And again, then just looking at the status quo, again, it's not statistically significant, different from zero. So we're saying that this, in comparison to your washing machine, they're indifferent. So they don't expect a compensation. Okay. Okay, so that's it. But then, so we've just looked at the willingness to accept, what individuals are willing to accept for these different attributes or these different characteristics of the particular curtailable contract. But of course, the curtailable contract isn't just made up of individual attributes, it's made up of a combination of these attributes. So what we're going to look at is bundling these attributes together to make contract offerings or contract scenarios. And we're going to look at the overall compensation, then what we call the compensating variation for these different types of contracts. So, and what that boils down to in economics is basically how much must you be compensated to make you as well off as before the contract change. Okay, so to make you just as well off as having the status quo contract, your contract as it is today with no curtailment, how much compensation do you need? Okay, based on different contract scenarios. So here we have 16 different contracts. Okay, but of course, it's actually 16 multiplied by 3 because we have different frequencies as well. So we have a frequency of 3 per month, 9 per month, and we have 6 per month, which I've omitted from this table so that we're able to see it much better. But basically here, if you take, for example, contract one is a contract that curtails the washing machine. It has no advance notice. It has no opt-out. Okay, and if you were to curtail this contract three times per month, then the welfare loss from that compared to your status quo contract, compared to your current contract where there's no curtailment, it amounts to €6.37. Okay, so €6.37. So that's compensation that you would be that will be required in order for you to be just as well off as you were before that contract. Okay. And again, of course, naturally, as the frequency of events goes up, then the compensations is larger. Okay, so the welfare loss in the case of 9 events per month is €13.12. Okay, so it's a larger compensation required for a higher frequency in the contract. Okay, another interesting one, I suppose, here is contract 12. Okay, and the tumble dryer is being curtailed in this contract. And in this scenario, you're going to have both an advance notice and an opt-out. Okay, and in this case, what we've estimated is that actually it's a welfare gain. You have a welfare gain overall from this type of contract. So there's no compensation required essentially, okay, at both the 3 months, the 6 months, and the 9 months level. Okay, so basically, households are willing to forgo their tumble dryer. Now, of course, maybe they're not using, this is an important concept I should have probably introduced earlier, but I'm going to address it now shortly, is maybe you just don't use your tumble dryer at those hours. You're more likely to use your electric oven during that peak hour because you're coming home, you're cooking dinner. Okay, then in that case, you can see that the compensation is required to have an electric oven, and in any of the contracts, it's huge welfare losses. Okay, or the quite large welfare losses. So you need a larger compensation to bring you back to being as well off as you were before. Okay. So, but maybe you just don't use the tumble dryer in those hours, but we did address that as well. We did ask questions in the survey about their use and when they use their appliances, and we'll cover that in the next slide as well. So there we have a section of contract scenarios, and we can see when and they don't use and when they do, or when they their expected welfare gain and loss from those different types of contracts. So now we know on average, their expected compensations, okay, for these different types of contracts. And also what we were able to calculate the choice probabilities from the experiment. So, you know, how likely on average are individuals going to choose each of these contracts? And in combining these choice probabilities with the compensations required, we're able to look at what we call a back of the envelope ultimately calculation, which estimates the potential curtailable load. We look at saved emissions, the potential saved emissions, and then of course the potential savings in monetary terms overall, okay, as well. So basically here we're taking each of the appliances, okay, so we have the electric oven, the tumble dryer, dishwasher, and washing machine. We're looking at the appliance ownership that we see in national statistics, but of course then from our own survey that corresponds with that. So we see like in the survey 89.51% own the electric oven. 89.51% of households own the electric oven, 98.8%, almost all households own a washing machine. And then we take for example, the appliance, we estimate the roughly estimate the number of appliances in the country. Okay, so based on the 2016 census, there was 1.7 million households. So if we just multiply that 1.7 million households with the appliance ownership, we get a rough estimate, of course, because some households may own more than one of these appliances, but it is based on household budget survey, it is a small margin. Okay, so for example, then we have 1,521,670 households that will potentially own an electric oven. Okay. But then we want to say, well, are they actually using that electric oven during the peak period when we're asking them about their preferences? And we find that on average per day, the electric oven is used 49.1% of the time. Okay. So, and again, 5, of course, is much lower than for the tumble dryer, and you can see that that's possibly where preferences are coming from, and 17.4% for the dishwasher and washing machine. So that's the average per day, the average use per day at peak. Okay. And then basically, assuming that on average, each of these appliances have a wattage of 3 watts, then we're able to estimate what we call the max power demand, including the appliance use. Okay, so we were able to multiply this appliance use by the number of appliances, and then multiply by 3 watts, which is the power consumption of the average white good. We get then the maximum power demand for the electric oven at 2,243 megawatts. The max power demand of tumble dryer at 183, dishwasher 576 megawatts, and the washing machine at 605. So not surprisingly, there's the max power demand for the electric oven at that peak period, given that there's such a large average use per day, at the peak period is obviously, of course, where you have the highest potential to curtail an amount. But of course, we haven't taken into account here their actual probability of opting into these types of contracts. So we need to take into account that next. And that's what we do. We look at a range of contract choice probabilities across the different contracts. And in particular, we focus on contracts that we ignore opt-out for the moment, and we focus on contracts that vary by frequency and vary by whether they provided an advance notice or not. Okay, and we find that the choice probabilities, so the likelihood that individuals on average are going to choose these different contracts range from about 13% up to 24%, okay, in terms of the electric oven, and say 35% up to 66% in terms of the dishwasher. So of course the probabilities are lowest for the electric oven because that was the least preferred option for the contract, okay? And then based on these choice probabilities, we're able to estimate the max power demand. So we're basically multiplying the max power demand by each of these probabilities. So 2,243 multiplied by 0.13 gives us 298 megawatts. And that gives us then ultimately, in taking account people's preferences or the probability of them choosing or opting into this is realistically the max power demand that could be curtailed, okay? So this is the potential curtailable load then, essentially, ranging from 298 megawatts to 543 megawatts, depending on the contract type for the electric oven, so whether it has an advance notice or not, or whether it has an increased frequency or not, okay? And we do the same for the tumble dryer, the dishwasher, and the wash machine, and we can see there. And basically, if we look at this graphic here, we can see the potential curtailable load. This is just those max power demands, taking into account people's probabilities of opting into these contracts. We can see here that there's a lot of potential curtailable load from the electric oven. The least potential curtailable load comes, of course, from the tumble dryer, given that it's not really used at that time in the evening. And of course, the color signals the different types of contracts that we examined. Like for example, here in the purple for the electric oven, which is deemed to have the largest potential curtailable load at 543 megawatts. Then basically that has an advance notice, and it has 3 times per month. The frequency is the lowest frequency, but it also has advance notice. So there's obviously higher probability of opting into that particular contract. So therefore, there's more potential load to be curtailed. Okay, so we examine that across the different appliances and across different contract scenarios, and we see what the potential curtailable load is. And then based on that, then we can estimate, based on that load, what the saved CO2 emissions, if we were able to curtail that potential, what would be the estimated CO2 savings in CO2 emissions? And again, all we're doing really in this case, so say for example here, the max power demand, including the choice probabilities for the wash machine here is 128. And again, just to look where that 128, that's this purple one here. Okay, so it's 128 megawatts potential curtailable load, and that's a contract that offers advance notice at 3 times per month as well. Okay, so basically we take that contract, we take that particular element 128, and we know it's going to be 3 times per month. Okay, so because that's the frequency, so we multiply it by 3 times per month. We multiply it by 3 kilowatt hours because of the potential power consumption of each individual washing machine, and then we multiply that by 12, which gives us the entire year's potential demand, and then we multiply that by 0.5. Okay, which is basically the specific CO2 emissions, assuming that the peak demand will be supplied solely only by an open cycle gas turbine. So making the assumption that if we weren't able to curtail that load, okay, and that load was demanded as such, then the demand for that electricity would be solely provided by an open cycle gas turbine. And that allows us then to use the CO2 emissions of 0.5 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. Okay, so ultimately what that means is, in terms of the electric oven, per year, you're estimated to save between 26 and 80 kilotons of CO2. And of course, that has the most potential. And then the one with the least potential, I suppose, is the tumble dryer, where you have between 5 and 14 kilotons of CO2 per annum savings. Okay. Then based on the annual power sector's emissions of 11 megatons of CO2 in Ireland, we just estimate the percentage, standard percentage. And they're small, okay, between 0.24 and 0.73% of power sector emissions are saved if we are able to curtail that particular demand, okay? But more importantly then, what we look at is potential savings, okay? And how we estimate these potential savings is we look at, well, if we weren't able to curtail this load and we had to, just like the announcement last week when the air grid went to auction, and they basically the auction means that there's going to be 9 more gas power stations coming up, power generators coming online between now and 2024. Well, what we're doing is looking, well, what if we had to replace that peak demand with building a new plant, essentially building a new open cycle gas turbine, okay? So we estimate the investment related on fixed costs. And of course, there's a process behind us in order to evaluate that, assuming like a weighted average cost of capital of 10% and so on and so forth. But we estimate that the investment related on fixed costs would equate to €73.73 per kilowatt if the investment was in an open cycle gas turbine. If that was what we built in order to meet that peak demand or meet that curtailable demand as opposed to curtailment, okay? So we multiply that 73 euros and 73 cent by the max demand curtailable, and we get an estimate, of course, then of the potential savings in millions of euro per year, okay? And we estimate that the electric oven has the potential to save between 22 and 40 million euro per year if we could curtail it. For example, the tumble dryer would be estimated to save between 5 million euros and 8 million euros per year, okay? And then we literally take those potential savings, we minus the expected compensation payments that certain individuals would require in order to engage in those curtailment contracts, and then we estimate the net benefits to the overall system, okay, from the utilities perspective. And what we find, just very quickly, in a sense, the X's here indicate the average net benefits. The average net benefits for the electric oven and the washing machine are across the board negative. Okay. Now, in terms of the electric oven, it makes sense because there's such high compensations. But we can see that, that basically from the electric oven and the washing machine, that on average, the net benefits are negative. However, for contracts curtailing the tumble dryer and the dishwasher, then at low frequencies, there are positive net benefits to the system. Okay, when you take those potential savings, you take away the compensation payments required by individuals, you can see that under certain scenarios where you've got low frequencies, and of course, if you have an advance notice included in the contract, then we have cases where we have a positive net benefit to the system. And in that sense, then, just to conclude very quickly, there is potential for end-use specific curtailable contracts with consumers to prefer certain types of the alternative contract percentage of them compared to their current electricity contracts, and that's key. There is a willingness as such to shift away from the status quo, and even they're indifferent between their status quo and curtailing their washing machine. But they're willing to curtail their tumble dryer and their dishwasher, and of course, then based on the use of that, we can see that, well, does that offer potential net benefits? And we see overall, the average net benefits of the system in curtailing the tumble dryer or the dishwasher at low monthly frequencies are positive. Net benefits are estimated to be negative for all the other appliances. The most important attribute is the appliance itself. That's clear in the contract. Is what appliance, what energy service are you taking away from the consumer? But also contracts at low event frequencies that include advance notice and an opt-out, of course, are much more preferred. So overall, really what it demonstrates, there's a potential role for curtailable contracts to offer demand flexibility that may help correct system imbalances and hopefully contribute to avoiding potential blackouts. Okay, thanks a million for listening, and I appreciate your time. And I'm willing to take any questions at all if you want to post into the Q&A. Thanks. Okay, I think there might be no questions. Thanks a million, everybody, for listening. Yeah, go for one, John. Yeah. I don't know actually how to turn on the mic, John, if there is. Okay. All right. The willingness to accept in table 2 are relative to the washing machine. Yeah, they are. Yeah, and importantly, that's an important implication. So yeah, so you're willing to accept 19 euros, say on average, to curtail the electric oven compared to the washing machine. No worries. Okay, thanks a million, everybody, for coming along and listening, and we hope you got something from it, and we'll chat again.